I can see live. I can see going live now. Okay, we're going live.
I think that was great.
Thanks, Maddie. Live. Okay. Okay. So welcome everybody. أهلا وسهلا فيكم. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sara Husseini. I am chair of the advisory board to Build Palestine, and it's my pleasure to moderate the first panel of what I know is going to be an incredible 2 days, which I hope will both challenge us and inspire us. I'm going to start with a few points on logistics. So أول شيء إذا بدكم ترجمة بالعربي نحط اللينك بالchat. So if you want Arabic translation, the chat now. We have about 40 minutes for conversation. So we're going to have a conversation with our panelists for around 25 and then aim to leave around 15 minutes for questions. So please use the chat function. If you have any questions, we'll collect them. We'll do our best to answer them in the time that we have. And then the other thing to add is that we're asking all of our panelists at the end of each panel of this summit to share their imagination for Palestine. So one sentence of I imagine what you imagine for Palestine in the future. And we'd love for anybody in attendance to also do that through the chat. So share your thoughts and we'll collect those as well. So the aim of this first panel, this opening panel, is really to set the stage by exploring the question of radical imagination, of what that means, what it can mean for us in the context of Palestine, and alongside other struggles for justice and equality around the world. And more specifically, to start exploring how we can come together collectively to either create or adopt or shape a vision for the future that is radically different from what exists now, that fulfills the aspirations for Palestinians everywhere, and that we can translate into action in the present. So delighted to have joining me today 3 fantastic panelists, and I'll introduce you one by one. If you can wave so people can see who everybody is as we go through, that would be great. I'll start with Dr. Yara Hawari, who is the Senior Palestine Policy Fellow of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She completed her PhD in Middle Eastern politics at the University of Exeter, focusing on indigenous peoples and Yara, help me, in indigenous peoples and studies in oral history, apologies. And he's also a frequent political commentator for a number of outlets, including The Guardian, Foreign Policy, Al Jazeera English. Thank you. Hi, Yara. Next, we have Mariam Barghouti. Mariam Barghouti is a writer and researcher. She's based in Ramallah. Her political commentary has been featured in places like Al Jazeera English, in the New York Times, Newsweek, and many, many more. Mariam's particular areas of focus include gender, socioeconomic inequalities, humanitarian aid, realities. Great to have you with us, Mariam. And then last but not least, we have Jihad Abu Salim. Jihad is from Dar al-Balah. He's currently the Policy and Education Associate at the American Friends Service Committee in Chicago and a PhD student in history at the University of New York. His areas of focus include Arab intellectual writings on Zionism from the first half of the 20th century and social and political history in the Gaza Strip. Like our other 2 fantastic speakers, Jihad's also been featured in a number of publications, including Nakba Files, Palestine Square, and Vox, among others. Yara, Mariam, Jihad, ahlan wa sahlan fikum, welcome. Really, really excited to get into this conversation.
أهلا فيك, شكرا.
Thank you, Sarah.
Okay. So I'd like to start by asking each of you, if you can, in a sentence or 2, just to begin with, until we dig a bit deeper, what is radical imagination, or what does the concept bring to mind for you? So Mariam, I think we'll start with you, if that's okay. Just give me a sense of what you think of when you think of radical imagination.
I think both Dr. Yara and Jihad can further elaborate on this, as it is an area of expertise. But radical imagination sometimes can be approached with a hesitant perception, especially because it's preceded by the term radical. And, the sensitivities that comes about this, and radical is often used as an insult, especially with, the marginalization of grassroots movements and activist efforts by policymakers and the diplomatic sphere. But to radically imagine means shaking up everything that is kind of familiar, and it involves a process of cognitive dissonance. It involves a confrontation of not just the reality, but of your own capacities, your own strengths, and your own weaknesses, to completely reimagine new structures, new interactions, and new ways of living, essentially. And that requires shaking up, not just in the public sphere, but also in the very, very intimate and private spheres as well. And that's what radical imagination is. As I see it, it's a process of challenging and a process of restructuring as well.
Great, thank you, Mariam. I like that a lot, shaking up everything that's familiar. That's a really nice way to put it. Jihad, do you want to add anything to that from your perspective?
Of course. I would like to refer to the words of a Black activist in the US named Angela Blackwell, who says that radical imagination is a process that requires thinking big, demanding better, and redefining the terms of the struggle to get there. And there is the key term here, because this is the place that we as a collective and as individuals, we hope to reach. And in order to think about that, we need to undergo radical imagination, not in terms of thinking about the strategies and the ways that will get us there, but also to radically reimagine our narrative and our story and what defines our work and who we are and what our role is in the world as a collective, as a people, but also as individuals as well.
Wow, that's really powerful. Yeah, okay, so Yara, now I know you specifically have written about this recently and this topic in many places, but specifically recently you wrote a piece for Al-Shabaka that was really fascinating. So if we stay with you for a moment longer, and when you answer this question, give us a little bit more sense of kind of what places and times and traditions you see this concept, what it is from the academic perspective, and just kind of fill out the picture for us there. That would be great.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Radical imagination really stems from a radical leftist political tradition in which we transcend temporal and spatial boundaries to imagine and plan for a world beyond power structures such as colonialism, capitalism, and patriarchy. And the concept has really come from indigenous people, Black folk, working class people, women, and others who all practice imagination not only as a survival technique, but as a form of resistance. So really in its simplest definition, it's a practice that imagines the world as it could be, and it uses that to inspire political action today. And I think importantly, we need to note that it's called radical because it's about total transformation and dismantlement, and it's not about reform. And it's also a practice that not only considers the future, but it also draws upon the past to explain how we came to be in the present, what do we want from the past to revive in the present and in the future. And I think this is also really important to think about, because there is a tendency among victors in conflict, among colonialists, to ignore or to insist on ignoring the past. And unfortunately, Palestinians also, internalize this notion that we should forget about the Nakba. Why are we living in the past? We need to move on. Now, this obviously ignores the fact that we live in a continuous state of Nakba, and we need to address not only past injustices, but also ongoing injustices when we imagine a radical future. For example, how can we imagine the return of the refugees if we don't address why they became refugees in the first place? And just a final point of, when we talk about radical politics and what it means today, I think we have to contextualize the fact that something has happened that has brought about the need for something radical, and that is the current systems and power structures. So the radical part of radical imagination speaks to that. It speaks to fundamental qualities and tenets of the system that need dismantlement and total transformation.
Thank you, Yara. That's a really, really helpful framing, and really helpful to also be very clear on what the radical piece means, and also the fact that the radical imagination is not the only imagination. There are many different ones that are on a spectrum of, you know, one place to another and good to bad, and who knows. So that's a really great framing. Thank you. So let's try and take this a little bit into the kind of Palestinian context now. Mariam, I'll start with you. So obviously this vision for a radically different future is a really powerful idea, but of course, incredibly difficult, right, to think about tangibly, especially in a situation of oppression that's so systemic, so entrenched, and sort of the resulting fragmentation as well in terms of the specific realities that we all face as Palestinians in different places. So I just wonder if you can kind of just speak a little bit to that, and like maybe what you see as some of the key obstacles that we need to overcome, whether inside ourselves or outside ourselves, to really begin this process of radical imagination, or continue it, if you will.
To start with, ability to begin radically imagining requires a certain condition to live under. So when Palestinians are expressing demands for liberation, they're calling for accountability, this is a form of also radically reimagining our society, but then the international community completely takes that away, delegitimizes Palestinian own vision for what liberation and justice looks like, and then proactively impedes our efforts. So if our efforts and our envisionment of our own reality is going to constantly be dependent on or hinges on the roles of the international community, this acts as a barrier to allow us to even go further. And then the other part of the obstacles that stand between us is that in order to radically imagine, it requires you to be an active member and to take proactive positions. It requires us to not be passive and accept our reality and engage with it in hopes of it changing, but to proactively act these changes that we want to see. And this means being empowered. This means having the faith that, yeah, we might be completely wrong, but we are willing to take that risk because we are our own agents and actors for change when it comes to our reality. So this requires a community building, and it requires a collective vision as well, because in the end, it's not just going to be, you know, Mariam living in this new imagined reality. It's not going to be Yara. It's not going to be Jihad. And of course, our demographic is not, and our socioeconomic background is not representative of Palestinians. We're here speaking in English, talking about reimagining, and we need to also hold our own selves within our position. And these are all obstacles on a very individual level, but they're also, they extend and kind of create a domino effect on a collective level. Because in order to be able to imagine collectively, I need to be willing to give the space and recognize that others will not imagine the way I imagine, that it's going to be dictated by our specific context and our experiences. And I think Jihad can actually speak more on this. But if you ask Palestinians in Gaza to imagine, you know, new realities, to speak about the dismantling of the system, I think it will be very different than me, a Palestinian in Ramallah, than Dr. Yara, who's, you know, a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship and has to navigate that entire reality and the different layers of obstacles in front as well. So these are all multi-layered, but they're also should not be seen in isolation, that they're all very connected. The obstacles come in tandem, which makes it more difficult to kind of unpack and begin dealing with each on its own merit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's so many cool points I actually really want to pick up on that. But I think, as you said, if we move to Jihad, because like you say, in the Gazan context, you had that, you know, you come from a place where, you know, a region where the population doubled overnight after the Nakba in 1948, you know, a place that's suffered recently 13 years of a strangling blockade, a series of devastating attacks and wars. And I mean, so if you can add a little bit on the context there, I mean, how do you even begin to radically imagine in a situation where people are just trying to survive from day to day, essentially, right? So yeah, I'd love to hear a few things from you.
Thank you. I think what we need to, when it comes to this point, it's really important to look for what unifies us, or what unites us as Palestinians in terms of our experience, despite the different manifestations of how this experience unfolded. And in the Palestinian context, as Dr. Yara said, the Nakba is the central unfolding factor that has affected and negatively impacted the Palestinian experience for decades. Whether when it comes to Gaza or the West Bank, or to Palestinians living in Israel or Palestinians in exile, the Nakba was one of the main processes that that still continue into the present. It's not only history lived, and it's not only history from the past, but also it's history lived in the present, not in the sense that we mark its anniversary every year. Not in the sense that we are building museums with keys, rusty keys, and deeds to our houses and lands, but in the sense that it created the conditions that define our current political, economic, and even citizenship status, experiences, and so on and so forth. So when it comes to Gaza, for example, many frameworks put forward by the international community and by certain Palestinian parties and NGOs and so on and so forth have failed to address why Gaza suffers from these many problems. And I think the common thing between these actors, whether the certain Palestinian elites, members of the international community, is that they fail to see how the Nakba is at the root of Gaza's today's problems. Just recently, I read that it is estimated that by 2050, the population of the Gaza Strip will double, meaning that today the population of Gaza is 2.2 million people. If this population doubles in 30 years, the Gaza Strip will be inhabited by 4.4 million people. The current population density in Gaza is 6,000 people living in 1 square kilometer. When this population doubles, this will mean 12,000 people living in 1 square kilometer. The highest population density in the world today is in Hong Kong, around 6,000 plus. And of course, this is the result of natural people movement in search of economic opportunities. But in the case of the Gaza Strip, we're talking about a case of confinement of people, demographic engineering that started in 1948 that aimed at trapping this large number of people in this very small territory. The Gaza Strip is just 1% of the total area of historic Palestine, in order for the state of Israel to be a Jewish majority state. As simple as that. So this is one way the Nakba continues. And if we want to radically imagine our future, that is to transform this reality, to reclaim the land. We talk about the land in a romantic way, but also reclaiming the land in our context is a practical solution to our problems. When we're talking about crowdedness and population density, high rates of population density, and so on and so forth. So again, the starting point to embracing radical politics and a radical imagination is to be able to define the root of the problem and to be able to define what is it that we want to change. Because in a current fragmented Palestinian political reality, and as a result of the Oslo era, we don't have this consensus anymore on 48 being, or the Nakba being the main thing that we want to change and challenge.
Thank you, Jihad. Yeah, so I think that makes a lot of sense in terms of getting back to the root of the issue, right? Which is the Nakba, and then working out how to go forward from there. So I think actually, Yara, I think this this could be a really good place to bring you in on this question of are there any already kind of concrete examples that we can point to? I know you've written recently about some initiatives in 48 Palestine to do with radically reimagining based on, obviously, the Nakba at the root, but based on a vision for the future. I'd love to hear if you could share with us a few concrete examples or initiatives that are already sort of in the making or taking place that might point towards this idea of radical imagination.
Yeah, I mean, well, there are plenty of sort of imagining and future visioning going on in Palestine, and there are plenty that are not, radical at all, that adapt to the system or work with the system. And I'm not just talking about the ones that are imposed on us by foreign elements, such as the Trump plan earlier this year, but very much local ones. And I think it's important to point these out so we can, we can give a good example of what radical imagining should be like. You look at the case of Hawari, which was presented as this futuristic Palestinian city, as a model for Palestinian development and investment. And this certainly was not a radical endeavor. This was actually a project that reiterated and reproduced power structures. Land was stolen from local villages, deals were cut with the Israeli settler colonial regime, homes were not created for those who need it most, the working classes and refugees, but rather a very small elite section of society. And unfortunately, there are a lot of projects in Palestine and in the West Bank in particular that emulate this, that, where profit and individual success is presented as a form of liberation. All you have to do is just cut a small deal with your oppressor. This is not radical imagination. This is reproduction of, the very power structures that oppress not only the majority of the Palestinian people, but the majority of people around the world. So, and unfortunately, this has strangled a lot of Palestinian civil society. So there are, small scale projects and initiatives that do, I think, embody radical imagination, which sort of acknowledge that settler colonialism is the current reality, but refuse that it will be the future. Some concrete examples, and this is not an extensive list, but some concrete examples beyond sort of daily practices which embody radical imagining include, for example, Salman Abu Sitta's work on return and providing, not only a sort of a rhetorical statement on, we will return, but a blueprint for return, showing that actually it is possible. Those villages do exist in some sort, that land still exists, and it is possible for those refugees to return. There are plenty of youth groups in 48 Palestine that are actually actualizing return, are returning to their destroyed villages and maintaining a presence on the land, that are cleaning the land, that are, learning about their villages with their ancestors. These are practices of, radical imagination. Similarly, there are so many cooperatives going on in the West Bank that, propose new models of economic sustainability and community that refuse capitalist frameworks that are incredibly important. They sort of take us back to a first Intifada era of community and cooperative work. I think that things like that are incredibly important. The problem is that they are individual, small-scale initiatives, and without, I fear that without a political leadership, without, a decent, legitimate political leadership, a sort of large-scale radical imagination is something that would be very difficult to think about.
Thank you, Yara. That's really helpful. And I think I'd like to give us some space in a minute to move into the Q&A, but I think one sort of final question I have for you now before we go into that, all of you, is, we're now, to take this into sort of the now, we're kickstarting 2 days right now of panels and of workshops and of one-to-one conversations with all kinds of people, from Palestinians everywhere, friends of Palestine, subjects like overcoming donor dependency, rethinking enterprise models, the role of art and sport and literature. It's going to be like a really, really full program. So if there's one thing or a couple of things that you would hope that other panelists, that attendees either think or do or go away and start working on, what would that be? And I'll take one from each of you. We'll start with Jihad, if that's okay with you, and then we'll move into the Q&A after we've gone through all three.
Yeah,
Thank you, Jeff.
absolutely, of course. This is an important gathering because it brings people together. It gives us a space to talk, hear each other, and to think and to imagine. And this is the act of imagination in itself is something that we as Palestinians don't engage in, because the majority of us, especially people on the ground, people in places like Gaza, people who are, you know, on the front line against the settlement enterprise in the West Bank, Palestinians in Israel who are suffering from discrimination, people in exile, most of these people are busy with the challenges of their daily lives and the challenges that are imposed on them by the occupation, by the checkpoints, by the blockade, and so on and so forth. So it is a privilege to be here. It is a privilege to be in this space and to be able to have the capacity to think, to talk, to create a language, and to be able to imagine. Because this is a rare opportunity, and because this is something that we don't usually get to do as Palestinians, it is important for us to foster this belief that the future is not a forbidden zone. It is important for us, and I'm talking here on an abstract level. I really don't have concrete things to propose. But it is important to remind ourselves that because we have been deprived of our past and we have been deprived of our present, the future is the only place where we can create the change we want to create. So let's just reflect on the beauty of this moment, that we're here together, capable finally to think about the future and to think about what a better future for ourselves can look like and should look like. So again, just let's foster this belief, let's embrace it, and let's think about our future in the terms that we have been talking about, that is centering politics that that give primacy to 1948 as the main as the main starting point that we need to look at and challenge and center in our politics and narrative.
In terms of just the leaving with the panelists, I want to add on what Jihad just said, is also another important aspect from these events is that Palestinians are so geographically, politically, economically divided that we don't really share the same experiences in regards to the specifics. So it is these coming together that allows for imagining that is more inclusive, that takes into the different experiences of Palestinians. A Palestinian in the diaspora is different than a Palestinian here, is different than a Palestinian in Lebanon, in Jordan, than those in the US. And that's what needs to happen. I think there requires an understanding of experiences under a common goal of liberation and justice and dignity and self-determination. But that on the practical level, on a pragmatic level, we can't provide a blueprint or a structure or a new structure rather that is inclusive of everyone unless we come into these events and we share these spaces with one another where we're calling in rather than calling out, where we're expounding and unearthing the resources that we have more transparently so we can reallocate and rebuild. Because in the end, just like you cannot build anything without the actual materials and resources, you can't imagine anything that is not based on the knowledge that you have. Imagination is always based on what we know, no matter how different and radical it is. So these sharings, the panelists, observers, all of that, it's a coming together, I think, and a weaving of a new structure.
Thank you, Mariam. Thank you. Yara.
You know, I think we're at an incredibly vulnerable moment politically as Palestinians. And I think this should force us to to look inwards. You know, our leadership have unfortunately spent far too long worried about what the West thinks of us, you know, begging for crumbs among our so-called allies who've sold us out. And I think it's time for the people to take control, to spend some time self-reflecting and really question what are the multiple forces at work in Palestine that are keeping us oppressed. And part of that self-reflection has to be a radical imagination process where we sort of break boundaries and barriers within us as well. You know, Frantz Fanon talked about this a lot. You know, colonialism has always been built on the idea that it would last forever, you know, talking about Algeria. But this state won't last forever, and we have to internalize that, and we have to believe in that.
Thank you, Yara. That's really, really helpful. Okay, so we're going to take a few questions. I've got a few coming through in the chat. So what I'll do is I'll just see what we've got and ask them, and then we'll see if any of you would like to jump in on any specific areas. So I can see 3 at the moment. One is around explaining the meaning of radical in the sense of how radical should we go? Somebody asks, how radical can our thought go and should it go? So there's one around that. That's kind of a broad question there. There's a question around the balance between instant, and especially in places like Gaza, like instant needs of people and food insecurity and the day-to-day challenges people face, and how, again, it's a kind of question to how we radically imagine and at the same time live and resist every day. And I have one that speaks a little bit to this question of the external versus the internal, right, which is about solidarity and both what solidarity should look like for friends and allies of Palestine, but also where Palestine sits in terms of other struggles around the world and how much alliance there should be there and where the energy should be placed in that sense as well. So I'll put those all out there. And if anyone wants to jump in on any one of them or more, then please go for it. And we'll just go around and give everyone an opportunity to answer. Who would like to speak to any of that?
I can go ahead and start with the question on the needs of Gaza and Jihad. I think you can build on this, considering you're a lot more familiar with it. So in terms of Gaza and needs and humanitarian aid and the provision of food, material, or any resources, it is absolutely necessary, but it should be looked at not as the solution, but as a step towards ensuring that while we work on achieving the liberation of Palestinian people, that we still have a Palestinian people. And that means that Palestinian people that are alive and well and still able to contribute in terms of imagining. And contribution is dictated by having the space. People in Gaza right now are experiencing heightened levels of trauma, anxiety, depression. There's an increase of disabilities. And of course, because resources are so limited, there is no ability to actually, or capacity to provide to those needs. So places people even under deeper insecurities on a social level and an economic level. There's increased fragmentation and social isolation. And Gaza is an open air prison. We're basically saying that at a bare minimum, to make sure that they're getting their meals. And that really needs to sink in, because humanitarian aid is often seen as the solution, and the provision of basic survival needs is seen as the answer to providing. And I think Gaza is the extreme case in point of how the entire Palestinian context is approached. So as the adhan goes, I will let Jihad maybe build on that.
Sure, thanks, Mariam. So a place like Gaza is talked about generally in the mainstream media through 2 main discourses. One is security discourse that tends to be dehumanizing and racist, and it tends to just, think of Gaza and its people as a security issue, probably in need of physical discipline through extreme violence every few years. And another discourse is the humanitarian one. And unfortunately, because of the nature of the leadership we have, and because of how international funding worked in from the 90s on, we have been certain leaders and elite in Palestine have presented the so-called international community as this mysterious entity that we shouldn't piss off as Palestinians, and therefore this led to the domestication of our narrative and discourse, making it always considerate of what the international community thinks, what the Americans, how the Americans will view what we're talking about, and so on and so forth. And this led to rendering an important aspect of the story invisible. And here I'm talking about, why is Gaza the way it is today? Why is the Gaza Strip a small territory of land with a large number of people, with no resources whatsoever, with no territory left for people to have normal urban expansion and to be able to realize their potential as a human being and have their basic rights? And for long, you know, we have seen how different frameworks, whether political or humanitarian or the security ones, have presented themselves as a solution. And in my opinion, all of these frameworks that have been put forward by the international community, and even by certain Palestinians who adopted partition as a solution to the situation in Palestine, have failed in addressing partly, like, at least Gaza's plight. So what is it that we need to do? We need to think about what is it that needs to change. Is it, of course, people in Gaza need food and electricity and water, and this shouldn't be a conversation either. But we need to challenge making people in Gaza having food and water and electricity conditional on what politics they adopt, on what politics they embrace, and what analysis and what vision they adopt. Because you know, the international community is not a mysterious being that we are, you know, terrified of. They are people like us who work in these organizations, you know, and we can confront them and talk to them as in, and we see them in the UN and in the NGO world and so on and so forth. So it's up to us to keep challenging these dehumanizing discourses that always want to keep the political out of the conversation. And the political is what matters. And again, we should not allow anyone to ever condition food and dignity on what politics we adopt and believe in. Because if we hand in this precedent, this will happen in the West Bank soon, and it is about to, and we're seeing the beginnings of that, and it will happen to Palestinians inside Israel. And it's already happening to Palestinians in exile, the very fact that they're prevented from return, right? So I think, again, this is a conversation that we have to always continue to have and address and challenge and think about.
Thank you, Jihad. Yara, we've got about a minute left before we go into the final statements. What would you like to add in your minute and a bit?
I will take more than that as a woman. Women deserve to speak for longer, so I will take us a couple of minutes.
Well, you're going to be speaking again after it as well.
I want to speak to the point about sort of elaborating a bit more on radical imagination. I know the word radical is difficult for some people, but I think, you know, it's important that to note that not all people who take part in processes to radically imagine, you know, are going to share identical imaginary landscapes. And actually, that's a brilliant dynamic of social movements and political groups, these tensions and conflicts and dialogues between people. You know, it's about collectivity and unity rather than conformity. And that's why radical imagination is not something static. It is ever evolving. Having said that, I do think that radical vision requires shared basic tenets and agreements on the dismantlement of certain systems and, you know, fundamental agreements on political ideology. And there is a real problem of, you know, appropriation of radical language, appropriation by people who try to repackage radical politics in something that is more palatable and more conforming or, you know, more liberal. And capitalism is really excellent at this type of liberal repackaging and morphing, you know, as demonstrated by companies and banks who've all of a sudden adopted this eco-friendly discourse and advertising in order to adapt to this change in discourse around the environment, and yet their carbon footprints and damage to the environment remains unchanged. Another example is the wide use of the term decolonization, particularly in the US and Canada. Some indigenous scholars, Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, wrote an important article entitled "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor." And they talk about, in their article, they talk about the increasing number of calls to decolonize schools, decolonize curriculums, you know, decolonize all this and that. And they argued that it's turned decolonization into a metaphor rather than a deeply unsettling process of dismantlement. And these are important endeavors, you know, towards social justice and, you know, having a more critical epistemology. These are all important. But they have objectives which cannot be equated to decolonization. And I think similarly, radical imagination cannot be reduced to a metaphor or a buzzword. You know, it has to come with a real practice of imagining dismantlement of power structures that oppress the majority of people, not just in Palestine, but around the world.
Thank you, Yara. That's a really great way to wrap that Q&A off. Thank you. Okay, so we are literally about to wrap up, but I did want to take the minute to ask you, each of you, for your I imagine sentences for the theme of the summit. So if we start with you, Yara, if we just finished with you, let's start with you again. What do you imagine?
I imagine a lot, but I imagine a Palestine where our struggle for liberation is led by radical women. Thank you,
Yara. Jihad?
I imagine a Palestine that, in the words of my grandmother, when I asked her what was Palestine like, she said, "كانت بلاد واسعة," before the Nakba. It was a wide country, a big country. And I hope for it to be back as a big country again that we can travel in and visit and see.
Thank you. And Mariam, we'll end with you.
I imagine a radical Palestine with the courage to defy until it no longer has to.
Amazing. Thank you so much. They're absolutely incredible imaginations. And so all that's left to say now really is thank you so much to all of you. This has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I think it's a great way to set the scene. I'm really excited for the next few days, and I hope that everyone who does panels and attends panels will think in these terms and try and start to really think more about what it means to really radically imagine. For attendees, just a reminder that we've got loads and loads of cool things happening behind the scenes. There's workshops and virtual exhibition booths and networking opportunities, as well as the main stage. If you want to learn more about Build Palestine, they have an exhibition booth as well, and learn more about their work. We're going to have now a short break on the main stage. We're going to show a video from one of our incredible partner changemaker organizations called Beit Butte. It's an organization doing some really interesting work around imagination and empowering young people to address difficult subjects in a creative way. And so, yeah, thank you so much, and looking forward to the rest of the event. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.